Hello, everyone. My name is Carmel Shachar, and I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. I am delighted to welcome you to Mental Health Moonshot, Unlocking Federal Funds for Psychedelics Research. This event is part of the Project on Law and Applied Neuroscience, which is a collaboration between the Petrie-Flom Center and our friends and colleagues at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Massachusetts General Hospital. We are excited to bring this event to you. This event will feature a very large, moderated discussion between the panelists, and so we strongly encourage you to submit questions so we can incorporate that into the discussion. You may be asking yourself, how do I submit these questions? There are two ways to do so. The first is to use the Zoom Q&A feature, which if you scroll towards the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a little button that says Q&A. If you submit your question through the Q&A window, Petrie-Flom Center staff, as well as our moderator, will see it and will queue it to ask our panelists. You are also welcome to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag MHMoonshot. Again, that's hashtag MHMoonshot. If you submit a question using that hashtag, Petrie-Flom Center staff will see it and pull it into the Zoom Q&A queue. Please do not try to use the raise your hand feature. That little blue hand on Zoom is very cute, but we will not be monitoring it. As well as please don't try to use the Zoom chat. That's also not going to be a way to submit questions. This event will have a live transcription, but we will be using the Zoom functionality for it, so it will not be perfect. However, we will then take the video and have a real live human being who understands these issues fully caption it and post that within a couple weeks. So please keep on checking the website for this video to be updated with the full transcript. I also encourage you to follow both Petrie-Flom and CLBB upcoming events, news, or education programs. You can do that in multiple ways. You can check out our Twitter at Petrie-Flom or at MGHCLBB. You can also sign up for our newsletters. The Petrie-Flom one goes out twice a month. The CLBB one is about the same frequency. We promise not to spam your inboxes. The best way to do that is to go to our center's website and click on the subscribe button. We hope to see you at future events. Now that I've given you all of the logistical spiel, I would like to hand it off to our moderator for the day, Alyssa Spitzer, who is Senior Fellow in Law and Applied Neuroscience at the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior and the Petrie-Flom Center. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carmel, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to thank the Petrie-Flom staff, particularly Laura Chung and Emily Remmett of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior for their contributions to this event. And I'd like to say a few words about the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. CLBB is based at Massachusetts General Hospital and is a unique partnership involving MGH, Harvard Medical School, Harvard Law School, and faculty experts across many Boston area schools. We promote and enable the sound application of accurate neuroscience to critical areas of the legal process. CLBB's primary focus is to equip those working in the legal system with the frameworks and tools needed to make better legal decisions and provide better legal services in order to ensure justice and fairness for everyone affected by law. Now I'll turn to today's event. Moonshots, a term inspired by the Apollo moon landing, are ambitious projects with monumental goals. The US needs an ambitious moonshot to address worsening mental health and substance use crises, which are leading causes of death only exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, researching a promising new class of drugs for treating mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders is a project with significant barriers. Psychedelic compounds, such as psilocybin and MDMA, are tightly controlled by the Drug Enforcement Administration, and research is expensive. The US has a history of funding moonshots with federal tax dollars. One example is the Human Genome Project. Another is the National Cancer Moonshot, announced in 2016, to which Congress allocated $1.8 billion in funding that year. Today, our speakers will address the possibility of a federally funded mental health moonshot built around psychedelics and analyze the obstacles to achieving it. We have 4 deeply knowledgeable speakers with us today who bring different perspectives to this topic. We are joined by Dr. Mason Marks. Dr. Marks is an assistant professor of law at Gonzaga University. He also presently serves as the Fellow in Ethics of Technological and Biomedical Innovation at the Edmund J. Safra and Petrie-Flom Centers at Harvard University. We are joined by a member of CLBV's advisory board, Dr. Gerald Rosenbaum. Dr. Rosenbaum is psychiatrist in chief emeritus and the director of the Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Disorders. He also directs the Center for Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Massachusetts General Hospital. We are joined by Dr. Franklin King. Dr. King is a psychiatrist at the Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Disorders and the director of training and education at the Center for Neuroscience of Psychedelics at Massachusetts General Hospital. And finally, we are joined by Melissa Lavasani. Ms. Lavasani founded Plant Medicine Coalition and is now its executive director. She led the Decriminalize Nature DC campaign, which culminated in the passage of Initiative 81, which made enforcement of laws against natural plant medicines, including mushrooms and other psychedelic substances, among the lowest law enforcement priorities in DC. So we will hear from each of our panelists and then open to questions and dialogue. And Dr. Marks, I will turn this over to you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thanks for that great introduction. Welcome, everyone. Before I get started, I should just say that I'm a member of the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board, and anything I say today is my personal opinion. I don't speak on behalf of the board. I'm going to provide a little bit of background and a little context for the discussion in case people are not familiar with psychedelics. So psychedelics are a fairly broad category of compounds that have psychoactive effects. They have some cognitive effects, sometimes some effects on perception. And many of them are synthetic. They were produced for the first time in laboratories about 100 years ago. The drug company Merck first synthesized MDMA in 1912. The Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann first synthesized LSD in 1938. And the psychedelic drug, which is primarily an anesthetic, ketamine, was produced in the 1960s. But most psychedelics are really ancient compounds. They occur naturally in hundreds of species of plants, fungi, and even some animals found around the world. And many indigenous communities have been using them for hundreds of years, likely even thousands of years, for religious, spiritual, and therapeutic purposes. And some of these naturally occurring psychedelics include psilocybin, DMT, and ibogaine. It wasn't until the 1950s and 1960s that Western scientists really began experimenting with psychedelics, and they used them in the context of therapy. They made some very interesting observations. They found that psychedelics appeared to help people speak more freely, perhaps access areas of their unconscious mind that were not usually accessible. And it's during this time that the term psychedelics came into use. And it means literally to make visible or to manifest the mind. These scientists also observed that psychedelics may ease some of the symptoms of addiction, like alcoholism. And that would be very useful today as we continue to see about 100,000 people die in the United States each year due to alcohol-related causes. And these scientists were publishing their research in scientific journals. They published hundreds of research articles on their observations, but they were really just starting to scratch the surface, just starting to get the ball rolling on psychedelics research when things started to change fairly suddenly. In the 1960s, psychedelics became associated with the countercultural movement, with opposition to the Vietnam War. There were some experiments done, for example, at Harvard University by Timothy Leary that were deemed to be unethical by some of Leary's peers in the psychology department. And towards the end of the 1960s, Richard Nixon became president. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which gave us the 5 controlled substance schedules that we still have today, 50 years later. In 1971, Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. And in 1973, he founded the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, which became the federal agency responsible for overseeing the controlled substance schedule. So Nixon really launched the war on drugs that we still see 50 years later. It was during this time that most psychedelics, the major psychedelics, became categorized in Schedule 1. This is the most highly regulated category of controlled substance, which according to the DEA has no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. I would argue, and I'm not alone in this belief, that many of these psychedelics, especially psilocybin, for example, are miscategorized as Schedule 1 controlled substances because they do have medical applications and they are not addictive. That's especially true for psilocybin. But the effect of this war on drugs has been that all that research that was started in the 50s and 60s came to a complete halt. And it's been that way for decades. What happened then is that psychiatry kind of took a different path, a path that was less focused on therapy. And it gave us this biochemical model of mental illness that has given us the drugs in the modern psychiatric pharmacopoeia. These are drugs like the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, like paroxetine or Paxil, and fluoxetine or Prozac. These drugs have helped many people, saved many lives, but they leave a lot to be desired because they take weeks or months to become effective. They have many side effects that range in severity from inconvenient or unpleasant to quite serious and even life-threatening. But most importantly, these drugs are often completely ineffective. I'd say that up to 2/3 of people who try an SSRI for the first time receive little or no benefit. And even when people try multiple SSRIs or they add other medications to the mix, they still receive little or no benefit. So there's a long way to go. We also have drugs like the benzodiazepines for treating anxiety. They can be effective, but they're also very addictive, far more addictive than psychedelics. And they can also be quite deadly. They've been implicated in many drug overdose deaths, especially when used in combination with other drugs like alcohol or the opioids. Fortunately, in the past 20 years or so, some researchers have gained permission from the DEA to study psychedelics in a very small number of patients. The DEA tightly regulates these drugs and actually limits the amount that can be produced each year, and it's a very, very small amount. Nevertheless, the results have been very promising. People with life-threatening conditions like cancer have reported significant reductions in symptoms of anxiety and depression. They've even ranked these experiences as being among the top 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. There have also been very impressive research studies done on treatment-resistant depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's not too late to pick up where the researchers left off 50 or 60 years ago. And I'd ask you to envision what might have happened if that research had been allowed to proceed uninterrupted. It's very unusual for an entire line of scientific research to be stopped like that. You might ask how many lives could have been saved if that had not happened. Fortunately, it's not too late for us to realize this kind of alternate reality, which could give us a far more effective field of psychiatry that offers people drugs that are far more effective with fewer side effects. But what we really need is a very large, publicly funded, a very ambitious program focused on psychedelics to improve mental health care in this country. But the war on drugs has done a lot of damage. It has heavily stigmatized these substances. It's propagated a lot of misinformation about them, misinformation and stigma that's been very, very hard to erase. It's an ongoing process. There's been some progress, but it's too slow, unfortunately, because we have a very, very serious ongoing mental health crisis in this country characterized by suicide and rising overdose deaths. So that's what we're here to discuss today, how to reduce some of those barriers, some of that stigma, and to go forward with an ambitious program to improve people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mason, for that context. Apologies, Dr. Marks. and Dr. Rosenbaum and Dr. King. You're up.
Okay, so I'm going first. We're going to split our time. So thank you so much. That was just a great history condensed into such a short amount of time. It's amazing. I just want to round out a little bit of the recent history of what's been discovered or rediscovered with psychedelics. So to delve a little bit into some of the specific conditions. So as was just alluded to, there was quite a bit of psychedelic research that was done in the 1960s. By the end of the 60s, there were multiple conferences every year looking at psychedelics, and the curtain really came down on medical research. And it's one of the only times, if not the only time, that something that was so promising in research was completely cut off for entirely political reasons and not for scientific reasons whatsoever. The researchers had nothing to do with the counterculture. That being said, what was really being primarily researched at that time was alcohol use disorder. So there's a ton of very promising literature from a few decades ago looking at that. And then you had this growing focus also on cancer-related distress and existential issues associated with dying and terminally ill patients. That was really just beginning to blossom in 1969, 1970. And so we really kind of had this several decade freeze out until the early 2000s, mid 2000s, when research started taking off again. And I just want to tell you a little bit about some of the studies that we know. So we do have a small phase 2 or a small phase 1 study looking at alcohol use disorder that was done by NYU using psilocybin that had some very promising results in reducing drinking over the long term. And they're actually wrapping up an actual phase 2 study looking at that right now for alcohol use. There is a really impressive study put out by Johns Hopkins looking at smoking cessation. This is an open label study. It took 15 patients. The average number of quit attempts was 6. So these are people who really had tried many, many times and failed to quit smoking, which as a psychiatrist is one of the hardest addictions to break. Found that a year and a half later, a majority of people still had quit smoking. So again, really promising. And this was just from a couple of psilocybin sessions. Meanwhile, we have a few different studies from a few different centers looking at psychedelics for depression and for treatment-resistant depression. So we have one from Brazil that used ayahuasca. We have one from London looking at treatment-resistant depression. And this has actually been inspiring enough to the FDA that they granted breakthrough therapy status to both Usona and Compass, which are 2 companies that are both conducting larger phase studies using psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. So the FDA is looking at this. In my opinion, I agree. I think they're moving too slowly, given how promising the research has shown these things. Meanwhile, in the realm of existential distress, I'm a CL-trained psychiatrist. I work on medical floors with medically ill patients. Some complex mental, physical issues that arise in that. So this is an area of great interest to me. We had a few studies that came out in 2011 and then a pair in 2016 that used psilocybin to treat this really difficult entity of kind of existential distress or depression or anxiety that can come up when people are diagnosed or suffering from terminal cancer, and some really impressive results. The 2 2016 studies found that 6 months later, 60 to 80% of the patients that went through these studies reported substantial reductions in both depression and anxiety, and this was with a single dose of psilocybin. So something really robust is happening here that actually has these long-term benefits. And then finally, we have MDMA, which actually postdates the kind of curtain coming down in 1970. MDMA was actually developed in the mid-1970s. And because it works a little differently than conventional psychedelics, it lowers barriers, it produces empathy and bonding and an impulse to trust others. MDMA ended up rapidly sort of growing, particularly in the Northern California therapy community, as an adjunct for treating PTSD. And it was really looking promising, but then kind of the same thing happened. It got out into the public, there was a media backlash, and the government under the Reagan administration ended up criminalizing MDMA in 1985. I might be off by 1 year on that. So MDMA, thanks to the work of MAPS, which has really been headed by Rick Doblin and fighting this fight since the mid-1980s, has actually had some incredibly promising results using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat treatment-resistant PTSD, people who have really severe PTSD scores. Some really promising results published in The Lancet in 2018, looking at PTSD and first responders, military veterans, firefighters, police officers, and they're conducting a pair of much larger phase 3 studies right now Again, MDMA also got the FDA's attention, leading it to also be granted breakthrough status. The one thing before I turn this over to Dr. Rosenbaum that I want to emphasize is that the context in which psychedelics used is very important, and that these are not just biochemical drugs that are being given to people. These are things that are being administered within the context of some sort of therapy. You can call it the therapist, you might call it the guide. Sometimes they're used more shamanically with a shaman present. But it's not simply that somebody is taking a pill and that's it. They're part of sort of the context of the therapy, with there's preparation, there's intention setting, and then there's integration sessions, which are when people sort of talk about and process and think about the insights that might have been achieved. And that's really how we think that the recovery ends up happening. So I think it's a little bit different, and that's going to be a challenge for the field of psychiatry as we move forward, to sort of incorporate this kind of hybrid model of something that is a medicine, but that really has this therapeutic context. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rosenbaum.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. It's fascinating. Dr. Rosenbaum.
So those are great overviews of important areas involving psychedelics, and so many things to reflect on. One thing I might start by saying is the brain is a learning organ. So that the brain gives rise to the mind can change the brain. It's an interesting reciprocal relationship. And the power of these medicines or these agents to induce change, reflecting on what Franklin just said, that it doesn't just happen by taking a pill. There has to be an experience with it. It makes us pretty confident that there is learning going on, and it's going on in a deep and accelerated way. And the way we try to understand that is in terms of how plastic the brain is. And we use the term neuroplasticity to understand the state that these agents induce, and that change can take place in an accelerated and robust and apparently enduring way when people are in that state. Around the issue of stigma, then, you sort of wonder why something that accelerates learning might be stigmatized. And yet there's an interesting split in the world right now. There's lots of enthusiasm, lots of testimonials about success, many dozens of companies trying to enter the commercial space around these products, a lot of enthusiasm there. There are academic medical centers in New York, NYU, Mount Sinai in California, at Berkeley and UCSF in the South, and Medical University of South Carolina, Yale, and others are setting up and have, through various forms of support, philanthropic funding, some granting, have created these centers for studying psychedelics. And that's where our program comes in. We call it the Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics. And our focus is really on what we think is a gap with all the enthusiasm and promise. There's still a fundamental lack of understanding of how this happens. I mean, we know where these molecules bind in the brain, but we don't know what happens next, why it induces this opportunity for change. And we created a center at Mass General to try to sort that out, believing that if we can understand the neural networks, the pathways, the gene expressions that are involved in allowing the brain to enter this state of potential change, that we can not only enhance the efficacy of current psychedelics, but we can potentially look to identify new ways to activate that system that might be more acceptable, more convenient, more tolerable, less burdened by a legacy of having been Schedule I drugs and so forth. So that's what we're about. I'll just double back and say a word or two about why. I'm a psychiatrist who's been in this field for almost 50 years now. And as Mason described, we've had moments of hope and promise that have sort of led to more realistic understanding of the limitations of some of our treatments. I've had a lot of medicines that had great promise until I studied them. And so I also want to urge a little bit of caution around all the optimism in this case, because you know, the trials that have been done, the testimonials that have been done, the open and controlled studies are all like some of the early studies we used to do with people who had high enthusiasm, both on the patient side and the research side. So, you know, we do want to make sure that that this area is well funded so we can explore with larger samples and more ancillary scientific research how effective these drugs are and why they're effective. And we got into this really because the focus of our department on people who have not gotten better from traditional treatments, so-called treatment-resistant patients. We knew we had to have new ways to treat. We focused on the problem of rumination, where people have stuck thinking that focuses often on self-deprecatory thoughts or regrets or events that they can't disengage their thinking from, and it creates a distress that you see really across all psychiatric disorders, whether it's depression, anxiety, addiction, eating disorders, and so forth. And it was when we saw that psilocybin had profound effects on a brain network that is important to the phenomenon of rumination, the default mode network, that we decided that this was an area to explore. And we reached out to try to obtain psilocybin for research and engaged with some of the community that has pioneered in this area, that encouraged us to build a center that now involves neuroimagers and basic scientists and cognitive neuroscientists and clinical psychiatrists. But the problem that we face is that the opportunities are so great that it requires a lot of resources, and they're hard to find unless you have enthusiastic philanthropic support, because the government is not quite there yet to get behind this work. I think that will change. I'm optimistic that it will change, but the opportunities are so great that it can happen soon enough.
Thank you so much. Ms. Lavasani?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so we're at an interesting place in American history as far as psychedelics go. Everyone has, Dr. Marks has given a really good rundown of what has happened in the US with policy on psychedelics and research. And you know, that screeching halt came hard for the research community, but, you know, the last 20 years have been really promising. And the last, I would say 10 years can really build an argument for the federal government to start allocating funds towards research. You know, I think that there is a lot of enthusiasm right now in this country with changes potentially to this psychedelics, and you know, there's a lot of discussion about descheduling and you know, the steps that need to happen to really, you know, weave psychedelics into our society. But we do have a long way to go. You know, my organization, Plant Medicine Coalition, is trying to spearhead an effort to get the federal government to allocate $100 million towards federal research through grants through NIH, National Institute of Health. So, you know, the conversations that we've been having at the federal level have been really positive. I think that people understand that the war on drugs is outdated and really damaging to society. People now, once we educate and do our part, in having these conversations with our legislators, they now understand that, you know, there is medical applications for many of these psychedelics, and they are very promising. I think that there is a gap between the activism and where our lawmakers are. And, you know, we should focus on taking the small steps that we can take towards changing US policy on psychedelics. But focusing now on educating our lawmakers on this subject matter is the key to everything. You know, I think those of us within the psychedelic community speak a lot to each other, and, you know, we nod our heads a lot and agree with each other a lot, but we have to remember that, you know, we need buy-in from our federal government to implement good psychedelic policy. You know, I think that was something that was missing from the cannabis movement. You know, there was a really a lot of momentum building within the states to decriminalize and legalize, but you know, we should have been having more conversations educating Congress and the executive office on cannabis policy. And now we're at this stalemate where states are increasingly decriminalizing and legalizing and creating markets, but we don't have buy-in from our federal government, and it's causing a lot of problems in the cannabis world. So, you know, I think with psychedelic policy, we can learn a lesson from that and, you know, move a little slower, let the cities and counties and states move forward with decriminalizing, but ensuring that at the same time, the federal government is paying attention to this issue and understanding that they have multiple crises on their plate that is coming up as soon as the pandemic is, you know, is hopefully slowly fading away. We are going to have to deal with this looming mental health crisis that was in existence before the pandemic started and now is completely exacerbated by this global health pandemic. And, you know, at the same time, our opioid crisis is worse now than it has ever been. And, you know, the current solutions we have to that are not working and people are dying unnecessarily. And these are issues that our lawmakers are going to have to address pretty urgently in the near future. I know that as soon as Congress and the president are working through the domestic issues and getting infrastructure and getting jobs going again, this fall, they will start looking at mental health, and that will become a real priority for this country like it never has been before. So I think that we have a really amazing opportunity to get some federal funding through the door and building up that body of research that is going to force our lawmakers to make some real decisions here in the near future.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting and such fantastic perspectives. A reminder to our audience to please submit questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. And I guess Dr. Marks was wondering if you could just say a little bit about, from your perspective as a legal academic, could you explain some of the connections between funding, policy, and law? A common thread has sort of been politics interfering with science, and it also seems like there's sort of a chicken and egg problem with funding, that you need the evidence to justify additional funding from the government. So if you could comment on any of that.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So Melissa kind of brought up some of the comparisons with cannabis, which I think is kind of helpful here. So with cannabis in particular, you really have that catch-22, where you need the scientific evidence to take cannabis out of Schedule 1. But because it's in Schedule 1, it's very difficult to get that evidence that you require. And I will point out that, you know, Biden and Harris did promise to reschedule cannabis on the campaign trail. That's something that has not yet happened. It's not being viewed as much of a priority right now. But there's an interesting distinction that we can draw there, particularly between cannabis and psilocybin. Psilocybin, we have far more evidence for safety and efficacy than we do for cannabis and for any other psychedelic, except for perhaps MDMA, where we're in phase 3 clinical trials, so very kind of far along in that case. But for psilocybin, the safety data is very impressive. The evidence that it is not addictive is very impressive. In the Netherlands, I like to point out, you can walk into a store and buy various fungi that contain psilocybin over the counter. And the Dutch government commissioned a study to determine what the risk is to public health. And it determined that there was negligible, little or no risk to individuals or public health being able to buy psilocybin over the counter. So really, it is an entirely political situation. The reason that psilocybin in particular is in Schedule 1, because unlike cannabis, we actually do have that evidence. It's not really as much of a catch-22. It would be very easy for the president to reschedule cannabis. It's an executive order to command the DEA to reschedule it. And the same is true of psilocybin or MDMA. or any other Schedule I substance. So it really is largely the stigma, the misinformation that's been perpetuated. Really the science is there for psilocybin. I'm not talking about necessarily for FDA approval. I'm just talking about for rescheduling, which is a separate process.
Thanks. We've gotten some questions from the audience about publicly traded companies being involved in funding this research, which I believe Dr. Rosenbaum, you also mentioned. And sort of wondering your opinions on what it means if funding comes from the federal government versus for private companies versus philanthropy, and how that might shape the questions that research is exploring and sort of what the effects might be down the line for ultimately patients.
Well, ideally, I mean, you want scientists, researchers, clinician researchers to be able to pursue their own ideas having in mind where the greatest scientific opportunities are, or the greatest benefits to people who suffer brain diseases. The risk in relying heavily on commercial entities to fund research is that they will often determine the direction of the research, and what you might think is a priority or the greatest opportunity is overlooked. Most research centers have a certain bandwidth, and if a lot of that is taken up with the priorities of commercial entities, you may delay progress. I guess that's the risk. There are some companies that sometimes are well established and have arms that allow a certain amount of independence and support a field, and you do see that. And perhaps as some of these companies get larger and more successful, they will develop more not-for-profit foundations that will support that. But right now, the most helpful resources for funding are from philanthropists. For whatever reason, there are a lot of people with a huge capacity for philanthropy who are interested in this space. Although at the moment it does seem that their focus is on access and to the available psychedelics rather than the science itself. So that's a bit of a challenge. Even government funding, I mean, it requires a lot of work to access, and often requires a lot of preliminary work that to be done before they'll fund, and what they'll fund is often very specific and narrow to what's been granted in it. And even of itself, it doesn't allow the kind of creativity and exploration that scientists need when a field is so young as this one. So, I mean, I guess if there are people out there with capacity and care about this area, look for areas of scientific opportunity to support, to really accelerate the process of advancing the field.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something that's probably only tangentially related to that question, but that I think is important in regarding kind of the future of psychedelics and the way things are going. That, as Mason mentioned at the beginning of this, psychedelics have been used by people all over the world on literally every single continent that is inhabited by human beings for thousands and thousands of years. And one of the byproducts of the war on drugs in this country and in many countries is that indigenous peoples that use these and have used these traditionally have been criminalized, and their religions have been suppressed. And so I think that is one important aspect of all of this to consider, that we don't want to medicalize psychedelics without being able to protect the rights of people that, in my opinion, do have the right to use these things. And kind of in an in-between zone, there's also been many people who have a lot of experience working with psychedelics who would never admit it because it's illegal work. And we're talking about sort of underground therapists and guides who would say that they've helped over the last 20, 30, 40 years, many people as clients using psychedelics. And so I think that part of this as we sort of march forward, and the medicalization is going to be how do we sort of protect those people and not exclude them from the benefits of what will end up being at least prescribable drugs in a medical setting.
That's really interesting, and also kind of points at the fact that maybe there are different, I guess I shouldn't speculate on this. Maybe Dr. King, you can answer this, but if there is any consensus as to the best way of prescribing or experiencing psychedelics, and whether there is sort of one pathway that you think the research is pointing to in terms of a certain number of therapy sessions and then a certain dosage and then a follow-up experience, or whether there is more nuance depending on sort of what your particular needs are. And yeah, just sort of if a religious experience can be something really valuable, how does that relate, or does it not relate at all to the medical field?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, we don't want to be overly incremental, but we do need to have a little bit of incrementalism here in terms of, I think there is a lot of concern in the field of psychedelics that if we just sort of blast open the floodgates and completely legalize them right now, there could be some adverse events that would happen that would jeopardize a more responsible path to bringing the benefits of these to many people. But I don't have any conclusions on the answer to your question. I think it's open. Part of it is the question of sort of how do we use psychedelics to treat specific mental illnesses, and are there different techniques that can be brought to bear in different therapy strategies? But a larger question is also, do these have to be restricted in the mental health setting, or can they be used for enhancement of personal growth? Can they be used to prophylax against development of things like depression? We want to do a study looking at that at MGH. Can they build resiliency or prevent burnout? So I think there's a lot of different sort of potential applications, but first we have to sort of continue with more research, which requires the funding, as Dr. Rosenbaum mentioned.
Thanks. We've also received some questions sort of basically asking what the bigger problem is, whether it is the lack of funding or the stigma and misinformation, weighing two evils.
Well, I'm a firm believer that if we bring science to bear on this, and we understand what's happening in the same way that we made a lot of progress in destigmatizing psychiatric disorders, mental illness in general, by understanding them as being not so different than heart disease. It's a combination of your life experiences and your diet, your stress, and your genetic inheritance, all combine. It's not biology and it's not environment. It's always both. Even though we have a journal called Nature, we need one called Nurture to keep the balance right. So I think understanding how these things work and will help destigmatize and help people understand exactly what's happening. Going back to the first comment, that you're really empowering the brain to learn. You're empowering the brain to change. Neuroplasticity is something that is a natural, but we can enhance it so that you can make changes in yourself. And if you have a psychiatric disorder, to gain relief from it. And the more we understand that that's a real thing and it happens, I think there'll be less stigma. At the same time, the testimonials and the data are lowering the stigma that hopefully will allow more resources to come into the area. So it's bi-directional there.
Thank you. And maybe also, Dr. Rosenbaum, if you can address this, speaking of neuroplasticity, someone has asked about the mechanisms of action of the effects of psilocybin on rumination in the brain. if there is a way to explain that doesn't require a medical degree.
Yeah, well, I don't think we have a full explanation. We have observations that, so people who ruminate a lot, and in psychiatric disorders, rumination is, as I said, transdiagnostic. You see it across many different disorders, and it may be a common mechanism through which the psychedelics are beneficial to an array of psychiatric conditions. But there is a neural network which is basically refers to how the brain connects different regions of the brain to create certain functions. And there's one that is importantly involved in self-reflection and a sense of self, and that it's called the default mode network, and it's a connection between different parts of the brain. And people who ruminate a lot show increased activity in that network, and so we think that's an association, or that's the how we understand it. It's the biology. And then in neuroimaging studies done by Robin Carhart Harris, for example, it was evident that psilocybin changes the connectivity of the default mode network, and it almost like it takes it offline. And then when it comes back online again, you see these changes. So as we were studying rumination, we decided that psilocybin might be a way to treat severe ruminators. When we have a study that will be starting, I hope, this summer, which is looking at patients with severe treatment-resistant depression who ruminate a lot, will receive psilocybin and will have neuroimaging before, proximal to, and after, to see if our hypotheses are correct, whether changes in the default mode network correlate with improvement in rumination, and whether we can exploit that understanding to create more accessible treatments for people. Interestingly, you know, although it has a small impact on rumination, meditation does help. Meditation is sort of a less powerful way to try to take your default mode network and quiet it a bit. But I don't know, Franklin, do you want to expand on that? Yeah.
I was actually just typing an answer into John Friedman's question about the need for psychedelic ethics, and was going to say that there's a good paper to be read put out by Brian Anderson. I think Charlie Grove was a co-author from 2020 on the need for psychedelic ethics because of the risks. And that the question of developing a professional organization does not exist right now, but there are people working towards that. So sorry, I was trying to answer that question for the participant.
No problem. I have a question for, I guess, initially Ms. Lavasani, but also the collective, which is that you mentioned the timeline of potentially this fall for some funding is the sense that you're getting from the federal government, and sort of how realistic really you think that is, and what barriers might exist to achieving that end. And then also, if there is funding that comes in the fall, what the timeline for this research realistically is. We got a question about, you know, the 20-year-olds who are currently suffering from depression and anxiety and who've been trapped at home because of COVID, and sort of if psychedelics are something that would potentially be available to them in this period of their life, or if the timeline is just many decades away.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think this timeline, I mean, don't expect our federal government to move quickly on anything. You know, when I'm talking about this fall, I mean, that I'm saying that mental health issues will become a priority for them. So, you know, we have been priming them up for that and in discussions about mental health in regards to psychedelics and how that can help alleviate some of that pressure from society. But, you know, let's say that, you know, we do get $100 million, best case scenario, we do get our $100 million appropriations, or we get a bill through. It will take years of working on the regulatory side of kind of designing a program that really works for the research community. That's why it's really important to have organizations like my organization, like Plant Medicine Coalition, that brings together all of the various facets of movements like this, can bring together the advocates and the people in the research community, and be that bridge that helps bring all these groups together to provide the best input possible, so the federal government can design a grant program that actually works. The worst case scenario would be to let the feds kind of design this program on their own, and then look at how research of how psychedelics could harm people. So we really need to be driving these conversations with our governments. As far as access goes with people who are in need, I can't advise on how people can seek psychedelic treatment in this interim period. I think that looking for any kind of federal rollout of something is going to take many, many years. Closer upwards to like a decade before we see the federal government moving on really passing sweeping changes. But the federal government is also going to be looking at cities and states that have decriminalized and seeing what works for them. So I think on a local level, things will start moving really rapidly. We saw after the last election where DC, my initiative, the Initiative 81, and the Oregon initiative passed, we have seen this kind of blossoming of city and state legislators that have taken up this issue on their own and have introduced legislation. Now, a lot of that legislation will not make it through and get approved, but what's happening is we are seeing lawmakers interested in these issues. They are taking a stand on it. Senator Wiener in California put forth a really comprehensive bill that is really inspiring. The language is great, and a lot of jurisdictions should really look at something like that to get things passed. But this is happening on its own really organically. So we got to let the cities and states pass these measures, and especially in Oregon with the psilocybin therapy, I think that the feds are really going to look at how that program is designed, how it's rolled out, and how successful it is. So that this is going to take some time, but as long as the advocates are there continuing to push these issues with our lawmakers, this is happening in our foreseeable future.
When you mentioned the fall, I didn't know whether you were referring to the study I mentioned that was starting in the fall, but that one is funded. So we have funding for 2 psilocybin treatment-resistant depression studies, one focused on rumination, one focused on others. And these were funded by philanthropists, or in one case, sadly, to memorialize a lost child, a young woman, her parent and grandparents created a memorial fund in her memory because she had treatment-resistant depression and was seeking psychedelic treatment. But before she could find it, she took her life. And the family made a gift to study treatment-resistant depression and rumination, which she had suffered. So that study is funded and will start in the fall in Boston, and probably will be approved to start recruiting early summer.
I'd just like to follow up really quickly on some of the points Melissa made. I'm kind of glad that she brought in this more local and state level innovation that's occurring. And I think that's what's happening, is that cities and states are realizing that this is an emergency and they're not willing to wait for the federal government to act. So right now there are 7 US cities that have decriminalized psychedelics, including psilocybin. Washington, DC is one of them, thanks to Melissa's efforts. And the reason they're doing this is partially just for social justice reasons. They don't believe that these substances should be criminalized, but it's also practical. They believe that they should be available for people to use if they could benefit from them. If the alternative is dying by an overdose, for example, or by suicide. And then Oregon, of course, passed Measure 109 in November, which is creating the first statewide regulated industry for psilocybin therapy. And there's a handful of other states that are considering following suit or passing similar legislation. And they're quite varied, including states like Texas, Iowa, Florida, Hawaii, California, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And so the last thing I'll say is, we're talking about federal funding for research. It's very important that the federal government does not expend federal funds to impede any of these programs. That would be wasteful, counterproductive use of federal funds. And the federal government should view these cities and states as partners in further developing the science and learning and pushing things forward.
Yeah, I thought maybe it's because of talking to people who were enthusiastic about psychedelics and hearing the testimonials and seeing the data, that those who were informed were all of one mind. And then a week or so ago, I ended up on a local TV show, and the other panelist was a former lead associate director of the ONDCP, the drug czar's office. And it was the first time I heard a colleague who was well informed in a discussion, or urge caution. And I wasn't really sure I understood why. I mean, I think of David Nutt's comment that when it comes to harm to self and harm to others, these agents are way down the list of as far as harmful compared to so many other things that are accessible to the public or accessible through prescription or what have you. But so it reminded me that we're not all those who are knowledgeable and influential are equally enthusiastic, and so there may be some work that we have to do there to understand what is holding them back.
Absolutely. So indicating the extent of interest in the world for this variety of treatment, we've had a number of people write in asking how they might become involved with the Harvard study this fall, or generally access treatment. Is there any sort of process that people can initiate involvement, or is that already closed?
This is a really poignant issue. Ever since we started the center and began talking about our plans for studies, I received several to a dozen emails a day from people telling their story, all very poignant tales of suffering, and yet our first study is 20 subjects ages 18 to 55 with multiple failures of antidepressants. And so it's a very narrow study, it's small, and a lot of the people who are writing have complicated histories or don't fall into the category. And so it's very hard to tell them that we don't have anything for them yet, and that it'll take, as Melissa says, it's going to take years for us to, I mean, even when the psilocybin studies and MDMA studies are done, the access and cost and the constraints around delivering them will be such that the excitement and promise that people feel that maybe there's an end to their suffering is just, it's just not imminent. And so, yes, we'll be recruiting 20 subjects who have treatment-resistant depression, starting to screen them this summer, but it's certainly not going to be enough for all the people who are seeking help. And we have a website. You can go to Mass General Psychedelics, and then you can get information. We'll post when that study is ready to enroll.
Thank you. So we are in our very final minute. I'm just going to go around to each panelist and ask if you could tweet out one key takeaway from the discussion today, what you would want the world to know about this topic. And I know we haven't had nearly sufficient time to discuss this very multifaceted issue, so feel free to be brave. And I will start with you, Dr. Marks.
I'll just say that addressing this mental health and overdose crisis is one of the most important issues of our time. It's no less important than the coronavirus pandemic, which is getting the majority of the attention right now, rightfully so, but we can't neglect mental health. We don't even know the full extent of the pandemic's impact.
Thanks. Dr. Rosenbaum?
You know, we're excited to look forward to having a new tool and a toolkit that will help lots of people that we haven't been able to help. And we share everybody else's frustration that the process to get there is going to take a bit of time.
Ms. Lavasani?
Yeah, I'll leave it with psychedelics have a real potential to change our society for the better. But, you know, we have to understand that the time that we've been talking about this, the time it's going to take for our country to really process this, you know, and undo decades of stigma that have been circulating through our culture. It's constant work, and, you know, it's not easy conversations to have about mental health. A lot of people like myself need to come out of the closet, psychedelic closet, and, you know, admit that they broke the law to heal themselves. But these are really important stories to share, and these stories, coupled with the scientific research, is what is going to really change the minds of lawmakers in this country.
Thank you. Dr. King, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of barriers and a lot of boundaries that prevent the healing from that. And I don't think that psychedelics are by themselves the panacea, but I think they really could begin to help the healing process for so many different things. And I'm really encouraged by where things are going. I would like to see things moving a little bit faster, and I would hope that everybody who looks at psychedelics looks at them simply with an open mind.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists in Petrie-Flom and the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.